Welcome back to Warrior Radio. My name is Tony Baldwin, and in today's episode I sit down with Judson Brewer. And Judson is an associate professor of psychiatry and medicine at the University of Massachusetts School of Medicine. And at the University of Massachusetts, he's also the director of their Center for Mindfulness. Judson also founded Claritas MindSciences, which combines mindfulness and neurofeedback techniques for a variety of health conditions. And over the last 20 years, Judson has really explored the science of mindfulness. He's published numerous peer-reviewed articles on the subject. He's been featured on things like 60 Minutes, Time Magazine. He's spoken at conferences like TED, and is just one of the key thought leaders in this convergence point of science and mindfulness and spirituality, and call what you want. And this is what the bulk of our interview is focused on. We talk about all the fascinating studies he's been a part of, analyzing, experienced meditators and putting them under things like real-time fMRI scanners. And he's also specialized in using mindfulness techniques to help with things like addiction and people that are addicted to smoking or eating disorders. And we really get into this topic in the interview, which I think you'll enjoy. And if you do enjoy this interview, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and give us a rating. It helps grow this project, and it just gets a lot of these little known, little understood topics like, the science of mindfulness out into the world. So with all that said, I present to you with Judson Brewer. Enjoy. For those that don't know, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
My name is Judson Brewer. I'm an addiction psychiatrist and the director of research at the Center for Mindfulness at UMass Medical School. I'm also the founder and science lead at Claritas MindSciences. Awesome. So how did you get into sort of the intersection point from mindfulness and science? Just because it's still sort of a niche field and there's not many sort of thought leaders in this field. So how did you sort of get in sort of the intersection point between these two areas? Suffering.
Yeah.
I'd gone through a bad relationship breakup at the end of college and was starting medical school, having trouble sleeping for the first time in my life. So I started meditating my first day of medical school after reading a little bit of a book by Jon Kabat-Zinn, and was planning, just to try it out and see what it was like. And it ended up, over the next 8 years through my MD PhD program, my practice deepened more and more. And I even shifted from doing molecular biology to doing human studies and eventually mindfulness research.
Wow. And you've had a few talks on some of these areas that I'd like to get into. And one of them is about flow and how we sort of get in our own way with reaching flow. But just for those that don't know, just to set a foundation, can you briefly tell us just what flow is?
Well, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi kind of coined the term back, I think, as early as the 1970s, and he describes it. There are a number of criteria that have to be met, but it's basically this state where we're it's selfless. We don't have we don't recognize ourself in the situation. It's effortless. It's timeless. It's immensely joyful. And it's kind of hard to describe conceptually because the experience itself is what it's all about, especially when it's not about me having an experience. It's just about the experience unfolding moment to moment.
Yeah. And so what are things that get in the way of these flow states? Like, what are the sort of things in the mind and sort of the cognitive things that sort of block us from that flow?
I think it's helpful to look at one of the criteria or one of the conditions that Csikszentmihalyi described as helping people get into flow as a way to kind of get into that question, because there are lots of things that get in the way. And he described being in situations, doing a task where it's, just above our ability level, but not much, not very, very high above our ability level. And this makes sense because, if we're doing something that we know how to do, our minds are likely to wander. We're going to think about something else. I grew up playing the violin, and I remember at one point my youth orchestra was paired with the symphony orchestra in Indianapolis, Indiana, and my stand partner, I still remember him saying, during the concert, I think about what I'm going to have for lunch the next day. And I'm thinking, but you're playing a concert. But he was so good at this, and they had played, they play these symphonies over and over, that he could play the symphony while thinking about lunch. So that's an example of somebody that is really skilled. He's a professional violinist, yet is so practiced at what he was doing. He's playing the violin without thinking about it. So that's the kind of the lower limit. The upper limit is when we've got something that's so hard that we totally struggle on it. So, for example, when I'm mountain biking, for example, if I have easy trails, I can just roll through the trails easily and don't have to think much about it. If I'm on some technical terrain where I keep, having to clip out and like walk my bike or have to, dab my foot to keep going, there's not much, it's like, it's kind of this stop and start bit. So that's also above the level. So, but when I'm in a spot where it's just technical enough where I really have to focus and concentrate and it's not super, super hard, then it's just, there's this sense of ease. Paradoxically, it's easeful because I'm not there in my own way. So why are those conditions? Why does he describe those conditions? Well, one of the biggest things I think that gets in the way of flow is ourselves. So if we start daydreaming, that's us mind wandering, right? Thinking about something related to me in the future, thinking about lunch, for example. And if also something's too hard, I'm going to be beating myself up over why I can't do this, or this trail sucks, or why, this or that. And that's also me getting in my own way. So there's a lot that has to do with kind of taking a situation personally, whether it's getting lost in my own daydream or getting lost in my own, self-talk about why I can't do something. I would say that's a huge roadblock in terms of why it's hard to get into flow.
Yeah, definitely. And you also say that to sort of get out of this future thinking or past thinking, sort of the bridge out of that is mindfulness, and that could help us get more into flow states. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Sure. The more I think about this, the more I'm convinced that mindfulness is really about training us to get into flow. And Csikszentmihalyi even describes that in one of his books. He says through meditation, you can learn to get into flow. So if you look not just at the modern mindfulness movement, but you look across many contemplative traditions, what they're training us to do is to get out of our own way, to not take things personally. There's a I think he's a monk in the Christian tradition who described ego as edging God out. So the idea is when we're front and center in the world as compared to the world being front and center where we're just part of it, that's where we're not in flow. So mindfulness helps us see what it feels like to be caught in the urge to, make pleasant things continue or make unpleasant things go away. And so there's a lack of equanimity there when we are sucked into that, when we're taking things personally. And mindfulness helps us identify those and not necessarily, get rid of them, because it's not about getting rid of anything. It's just about seeing them, but importantly, seeing how painful they are. So when we get sucked into into craving, and we, eat 12 cupcakes and then our stomach feels like a rock, mindfulness says, helps us pay attention to the results of that. Oh, what did I get from that? Oh, my stomach feels like a rock. And now I need to go take a nap to sleep off this sugar, high and crash. So it's about really learning to find these sweet spots of equanimity to be with the push and pull without being sucked into them.
And for those that are listening, a lot of people have been practicing mindfulness, and a lot of times they talk about how difficult it can be, and their monkey mind is just seems almost beyond their control, and they have a lot of difficulty with this practice. Why is it so difficult to sort of put into practice the things we hear about mindfulness?
So one hypothesis, and this is just a hypothesis, I could be way off here, is that we approach mindfulness the wrong way in the West. So in our Western mind, our prefrontal cortex, highly developed, it knows how to do stuff. So then we get a book about mindfulness that says, and we say, I'm going to do mindfulness.
Right. Yep.
And the more we try to do it, the farther away we get from actually being it. Because it's really about tapping into our own natural awareness, which is here, right? How hard is it to hear the sound of my voice? It is effortless. Yep. Okay. So what is it? So it's not about doing stuff. It's not about doing mindfulness or doing meditation. It's about seeing clearly, here's what it feels like to get caught up. And when we're seeing clearly, we're being mindful without having to do anything.
Yep. Now you were part of a study that took experienced meditators and put them under fMRI scanners. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you saw in that study?
Sure, and we've done a number of them now, but you might be talking about the first study that we did. So this was back in 2011. We published this. I was really curious to see what experienced versus novice meditators' brains were like, because I had just done a study with smoking cessation and found that we could train people in mindfulness, and they did 5 times better than gold standard treatment at quitting smoking compared to this gold standard treatment. And we were like, wow, that's amazing. What's going on? So we started with a cross-sectional study with experienced and novice meditators and asked the simple question, not only what's happening in somebody's brain when they're meditating, and especially an experienced meditator, but what's common across a number of different meditation practices. Because if there's some commonality, then we can tap into that, and that teaches us a lot more about the universal experience that we all have, as compared to, here's the one technique that we should use, which is, whenever somebody says that, that's generally a red flag. So we looked across 3 different meditation practices. The very familiar one of paying attention to one's breath. One called loving kindness, where it's kind of this cultivation of intentional well-wishing for ourselves and others, and then a practice called choiceless awareness, where whatever arises in our experience becomes the object of meditation. So we're not directing our attention to the breath or to well-wishing, but we're just whatever arises, sound, smell, body sensation, that becomes the momentary object. And what we found there when we looked at experienced versus novice meditators was that the first thing we found was a non-finding. So I was going in there thinking, okay, we're going to find the brain regions that get active during meditation. And we didn't find jack. There wasn't a single brain region that was increased in activity in experienced versus novice meditators. And we looked hard for that. And we scratched our heads and said, okay, that's interesting. Maybe we need to revisit our hypotheses here. And so we started saying, well, let's just look across the whole brain and see what's different. And what we found was fascinating. There were there were only about 4 brain regions across the entire brain that were different between experienced and novice meditators. So that in itself was interesting. And the other thing that we found was that there were 2 brain regions, these 2 interconnected brain regions that are hubs of the default mode network that were deactivated in experienced versus novice meditators. Now, this is important because the default mode network is implicated in mind wandering. It's also implicated in craving. It's indicated in guilt. It's implicated implicated when we're ruminating, when we're getting lost in a habit loop about thinking about how bad we are. So there's this network that suddenly makes a lot of sense that is decreased in activity in experienced versus novice meditators, especially a brain region called the posterior cingulate cortex.
Wow. And how often is this default mode network just on for most people throughout the day?
Are you ready for this?
Yeah.
About 50%.
Wow. 50%.
Yeah. So there were several studies that linked it just through experience sampling throughout the day, when they asked people what they were doing, they found that their minds were wandering about 47% of the time. And then there was another study that became the Sentinel study, where this guy, Mark Rakel, and his group at Washington University in St. Louis, they were finding that this default mode network was getting activated during a baseline task. And the task was, don't do anything in particular.
Wow.
Okay. And they sat on their data for several years because they did not know what to make of them. This was supposed to be a baseline task that wasn't supposed to show any particular activity. It is now – so that paper is now like one of the most highly cited papers in all of neuroimaging because it's been reproduced so many times. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow.
Crazy.
So it's just kind of humming in the background for half our waking consciousness during the day. And then one area that you said of the default mode network is this posterior cingulate. And you said this sort of gets really activated when we get caught up in our experiences. You touched on this briefly, but can you talk a little bit about this further?
I'd be happy to. And there were a couple of TED Talks that I gave about this. If people want to see the graphics and where this brain region is, they can just look for my name. But basically, the posterior cingulate is this hub that links this medial prefrontal cortex, which is thought to be involved in the conceptual self. So like I look in the mirror and I realize, oh yeah, I am Judd. And that gets – the posterior cingulate links this conceptual self to memory regions, to a bunch of other brain regions. And it seems to be activated when we're literally mentally and physically contracting. So we did some real-time neuroimaging studies where we could use real-time neurofeedback with fMRI to link up people's subjective experience to their brain activity. And when we looked at the posterior cingulate cortex, it was activated not only when people were mind wandering, but also when they were trying to force things, when they were really kind of bearing down and trying to make things happen. And that's what gave us the clue that this was not, we think of it as more of like an experiential self. Because if you have a contraction, suddenly there's a barrier between you and the rest of the world. And if you take the opposite of contraction, expansion, and you take that to infinity, suddenly you can't find a boundary between yourself and the world. So bringing this back to flow, no boundary, no self, and no problem.
Yeah, because a keyword I often hear with default mode network is self-referential processing.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, so the self-referential processing relates to daydreaming, planning, autobiographical memory. So basically thinking about how we are relating to the world, whether it's in the past or the future or even in the present.
Wow. Okay. And you also did a study where people chose, I don't know if it was you, but you referenced it in one of your talk where people chose to rather talk about themselves and earn money. And you were saying a certain area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, it gets activated during this self-referential talk. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Yes. So there was a study done at Harvard in 2012. I'm forgetting the first author's last name right now, so my apologies to you Harvard researchers. Where they basically, they scanned people's brains while they were offered money versus, basically self-disclosing. And they found that when they were self-disclosing, that they would activate the nucleus accumbens, which is the kind of the downstream brain region that gets dopamine spritzes in the reward processing loop. So it also gets active. The nucleus accumbens is famous because any drug of abuse causes nucleus accumbens activity. So what they were showing was that, basically we can get addicted to ourselves just like we can get addicted to cocaine or to heroin or to alcohol or anything else. Now, here's another study that just came out that's fascinating. There was a study where they took adolescents and they simulated their Instagram feeds, in the scanner. And the only manipulation they did was the number of likes that the kids got. So they were showing them their own Instagram feeds and they just manipulated the number of likes. And they compared, blocks where they got a lot of likes versus blocks where they didn't get very many likes. Now, not only did these kids activate their nucleus accumbens, but they also activated their posterior cingulate cortex. And so here is a link between these reward processing centers and the self-referential brain regions as well.
Wow. And when you were putting people in the fMRI scanners, they got sort of the real-time feedback on their sort of what was going on in their brains, and it helped them sort of get their minds quieter. Can you talk a little bit about how the neurobiofeedback helped these participants?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Now, I'll first say that this study wasn't actually about giving people neurofeedback. We were using it for neurophenomenologic confirmation of our hypotheses around what these brain regions were doing and linking those up with their subjective experience. What was fascinating was that they kind of couldn't help but use this as – a couple of folks couldn't help but kind of use this as neurofeedback because they were seeing some really clear things that they hadn't noticed before. So, for example, we had some novices. There was a guy that he was getting feedback and the graph got really high, like his posterior cingulate was getting really activated. And he said, I was thinking about my breath and it went red. So that's strange. Maybe your apparatus doesn't really work. And in the very next run, it looked like he had a brain transplant. His brain was all decrease in activity. The graph was blue as compared to red in the paradigm that we were using. And we asked him afterwards, he was like, wow, that was amazing. He said, I noticed the difference between feeling the physical sensations of my breath and thinking in and out. And so what he had recognized and what he had learned from the neurofeedback was this isn't a cognitive exercise, but we often live in our heads. We walk around disembodied 50% of the day, if not more. Yep. And he's like, oh my God, I have a body and I can pay attention to what the physical sensations feel like. Yeah. And that's what these practices are all about, is this embodied presence of just knowing what's happening.
And for some of the folks out there who are into sort of self-experimentation or self-tracking, and they want to get into, neurobiofeedback-based meditation, but don't have the fMRI scanners and whatnot. Is there any maybe consumer-level equipment or devices that you could recommend or that you've heard that works well with just everyday folks out there?
It's a good question. I don't think that many folks – so we have now moved to EEG neurofeedback. And unfortunately, our research rig costs about $80,000. Yeah. And if folks haven't – there's a 60 Minutes episode where Anderson Cooper actually comes into our lab and tests out our rig that you can probably find on YouTube or something. So people can see what that looks like. We're now starting to test. So we've been able to move from 128 leads down to about 32. And with 32 leads, we can get about 95% of the same signal because, again, we're trying to get deep brain structures. So really looking not just at surface electrical activity, but activity from specific brain regions that are not at the surface. So this isn't something that you could just take a commercial headset to do. So we hope, and we're hopefully in the next couple of months, we'll start testing more commercially available rigs that have 32 leads that don't cost $80,000. But right now, the commercial stuff that just has a couple of leads that looks at scalp electrical activity, there's nothing out there that does what we're looking at. So what I'd recommend to people is, save your money. Yeah. And also you can pay attention to your own body. That's free. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Things like
exactly. Paying attention to your stress signals and your arousal levels and things like that. That's something that we're all pretty experienced with. And exactly what you're saying, it's free. Another thing that you sort of specialize in is breaking habits and bad and addictions and whatnot. So just to sort of set a foundation on this area of the interview, how do bad habits and addictions form in the brain?
Great question, and we can just build on what we've been talking about. So I'm going to link up the experience with the brain activity, because those two obviously go together. So let's use something that we can probably all relate to, eating food that tastes good. Okay. So let's say we eat a cupcake or a piece of chocolate, and this gets registered on our stomach is especially sugar, sends a dopamine signal. So it relays a dopamine signal up through the ventral tegmental area into the nucleus accumbens. And so there's this reward that happens when we eat sugar that activates the same reward centers as other drugs of abuse, as I was talking about earlier. So that's kind of how habits can get set up. And the system may have been, I wouldn't say designed, but may have evolved so that we'd remember where food is. And it happens when we are, so you can break it down to, the basics of, like, if there's a trigger, we see food that we'd previously, that looks like food that we'd previously eaten that tasted good. And we have this memory that says, oh yeah, that looks like food that's going to give you some calories. And so we eat it. And then we learn, okay, this is food that gives me calories. So that's the behavior, is eating it, and then the reward is that that dopamine hit. Now, where this can turn into bad habits is if our very clever brain says, you could use this for more than just learning where food is. When if it feels good, when you feel bad, why don't you eat a cupcake so you feel better? And so we learn this, and then we start developing the habit of stress eating, because the same dopamine hit comes that tells us, oh, you feel better when you eat a cupcake as compared to when you wallow in self-pity when your boss yelled at you or something like that. So same neural mechanism, and this is very well described in the animal and human literature. It's called operant conditioning, or positive and negative reinforcement. So those three pieces need to be there: a trigger, a behavior, and a reward.
Awesome. And then, so another thing that you talk about how sort of ineffective it typically is on relying on sort of conscious thought and cognition and the prefrontal cortex area of our brain, and try to will ourselves to end bad habits. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Right. So as I said earlier, this is related to flow as well. When our prefrontal cortex comes in, it says, "Oh, I'm going to just stop eating cupcakes."
Yeah.
and our older parts of the brain they're just sitting back laughing, and they're like, "Good luck, have fun with that."
Yeah.
Because they know as soon as that prefrontal cortex gets stressed out or tired, it's going to go offline, because it's the youngest part of the brain from an evolutionary perspective. So as soon as it goes offline, these older parts of the brain come in, and they're like, okay, back to the old habit. Yeah.
And so, but you've done studies tracking or sort of introducing mindfulness to people that are addicted to things like smoking. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the studies that you've done and the results with this study?
Sure. So we've done studies with smoking, and more recently with stress and emotional eating. With smoking, we've found that when we train people in mindfulness, comparing it, and they don't even know that they're getting mindfulness when they come into these studies. So, they know that they're getting some type of behavioral treatment, and that it's supposed to help them quit smoking. So we have them come into the to the study, and they start this group, and then we say, okay, go ahead and smoke. And they look at us like we're crazy. And we say, no, go ahead and smoke. Just pay attention as you do. And what they discover is that smoking doesn't actually taste very good. So that's actually the first critical component of breaking a habit, is having some motivation to move forward from an experiential standpoint. So they start to see, the reward that I thought I was getting from this isn't actually that rewarding. So they start to recalibrate that reward loop that we're talking about, and then, I'm not as excited to smoke. And then we train them in mindfulness so that they can learn to really drop into their body and get curious about what cravings feel like themselves. Now, a craving itself is typically unpleasant, but when they get curious, curiosity is actually a pleasant sensation. So they can actually flip the valence of that very moment from a craving to curiosity and not be so beaten up by the craving. And they can also see that these are just body sensations. These are this tightness, it's burning, it's tension, it's clenching, and that's what the craving is made up of. And that these sensations come and go. So they start to regain control of their experience as compared to being sucked into that that habit loop of smoking to make that unpleasant craving go away as quickly as possible.
And so just to go back on sort of the results, the mindfulness versus sort of the traditional solutions for ending smoking addiction. Can you talk a little bit about more the results between the two?
Sure. When we looked at smoking cessation, so had people quit and stayed quit smoking, at the end of treatment, it was twice as good as gold standard, the American Lung Association's freedom from smoking in this case. And when we looked 4 months later, these folks had maintained their gains, and the folks in the control group had lost, some of them had gone back to smoking. So at that point, there was a 5x differentiation. So that it was 5 times better than gold standard treatment.
Wow, that's amazing. And another thing that you've sort of recommended is actually apps and certain technology to help with this mindfulness and breaking bad habits. And you actually created one called Craving to Quit. Can you talk a little bit about that app?
Sure. So we looked at our manualized treatment and said, okay, we found that this is efficacious. We had also found behavioral mechanism that it did decouple craving and smoking in the operant conditioning paradigms. And so said, well, how would we actually disseminate this? And one of my colleagues at Yale was finding that it's hard to get good in-person dissemination of training because you got to train the people to do it and then make sure that they're doing it correctly. So we moved to delivering it through people's phones, because when they go out to smoke, they're holding their phone in one hand and they're holding their cigarette in the other. So we said, well, let's just deliver it right there. Yeah. And so we cut it into bite-sized pieces, made videos, animations, in-the-moment exercises to help people write out their cravings that would be delivered, 5 minutes a day over a 3-week period. And they could go back to the exercises. So there are lots of benefits to having app-based training. We could also do in-app coaching. So, they can ask our trained coaches questions, and the coaches can help them and guide them through and make sure that they're doing well. We can also pair this with an online community, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a bunch of ways that we can support people that have high fidelity, they lower cost, and make these more accessible, especially to people who don't have access to healthcare. So it's really important that we take care of our underserved populations, and this is a way that we can start to do this. So we did that. It's Craving to Quit is now in 3 or 4 clinical trials, and some of them are, they're at various stages of completion. And we've also done the same thing with stress and emotional eating. We had some people report that using some of the practices that they were actually changing their eating habits, which was a big eye-opener to us, because one of the big reasons that people don't quit smoking is fear of weight gain. Right? Because one of the substitution strategies for smoking is to eat food, eat candy, or eat carrot sticks. So, there's on average, I think people gain about 15 pounds when they quit smoking. And some people would rather smoke than gain 15 pounds. Seriously. Like that's a big barrier, especially for women in today's society where there's a lot of emphasis on body image and all of that. So we said, well, let's see what we can do, because these mechanisms are the same. And over the course of several years, did iterative development of a program called Eat Right Now, first with pilot tested, and then I tested in my clinic with people who had binge eating disorder, and then we've launched it to the public, but also just completed our first clinical trial, just looking to see if we could decouple craving and eating and stress eating, and we found that indeed there's a significant reduction in or a decoupling of craving and stress eating, and even a modest but significant weight loss, which wasn't even our primary aim. We were just looking to see if we could, understand its mechanisms. So that program seems to be working pretty well as well.
Wow, it's amazing. And for those listening, we'll have links on the blog post for all these if you want to learn more about these apps. just to switch things up a little bit, and give you some random fire questions, are there any sort of transformative technologies that you've used in your own life that's benefited you with things like mindfulness or just general well-being mentally?
Good question. Transformative technologies, and awareness doesn't count as a transformative technology.
Yeah, I mean, that might be the ultimate transformative technology.
When I did a lot of pilot testing myself when we were developing our real-time neurofeedback paradigms, I'd been practicing for a long time at that point. So when I tested out our feedback, whether it was fMRI or EEG, it was kind of confirming, my own practice. So I wouldn't say that was like transformative. It was more confirmatory.
Yeah.
And I think our aim is like for novices, eventually this technology will be transformative because it can really help them, help augment training rather than, people trying to figure this out on their own. So, I would say depending on someone's level of training, something like neurofeedback could be really helpful. I haven't found that things like self-tracking have been as helpful. Sometimes they can be very distracting, which is paradoxical if we're trying to train to do something. And there have even been studies. There was a published study recently showing that fitness tracking was actually it didn't help and possibly was hindering weight loss for people in standard weight loss paradigms. So I think we have to be careful about technologies, and importantly, I think look for technologies that are based on mechanism.
Yeah.
So if we understand a mechanism, like for example, with the mindfulness training, we find brain regions that line up with experience, and we can use neurofeedback. Like that's a technology that's probably going to be helpful because it's all mechanistically based. Our apps are based mechanistically on how the habit loops are formed. So and they seem to be efficacious in that manner. But honestly, this is such a young field. I think a lot of people have been developing technologies and are trying to figure out afterwards mechanistically how and if and why they might work. I'm guessing in the next couple of years more technologies will be developed from the mechanistic standpoint and then applied. But I think that takes a little bit longer because you have to first understand the science behind, a process and then develop the technology as compared to, oh, look, I can track the number of steps that I walked in a day.
Yeah. Now, for sort of the layman and the people that are sort of just enthusiasts with a lot of sort of this neuroscientific talk mixed with sort of mindfulness and whatnot, is there any sort of websites or blogs or magazines that you would recommend for these folks to explore these subjects?
It's a good question. I've written a fair amount on the Huffington Post. So whenever we have a new paper that comes out, or if there's somebody else's paper that's really interesting, I'll try to blog about that. So they can look at my Huffington Post blog. I don't want to be too self-referential, but and I also have a book that's coming out called The Craving Mind that highlights a lot of this science, not only that we've done, but others have done as well. So folks can find that on Amazon. But I'm just trying to think, where would there be, the Greater Good Science Center, I think tries to maintain a lot of this work and curate it carefully. So that might be a place to take a look. And I'm guessing they blog or do some way to get that information out there because it's about the greater good. Yeah. I know that Mindful Magazine has like a science roundup, and I'm guessing that that's also available on their website. I've mostly seen it in their print periodical, but I'm guessing that's also available. And there, what else is there? Those are two that immediately come to mind.
Awesome. Yeah. And again, for those listening, we'll have all the links for you guys. And is there any other thought leaders in this particular area? I know it's still an emerging area, and there's not many people like yourself that are really sort of exploring these areas. But is there any other thought leaders that you particularly pay attention to?
There are lots of folks that are doing great work, and it just depends on the area that you're talking about.
Yeah. Maybe like mindfulness and neuroscience in that area. Is there any other thought leaders that you particularly listen to?
Yeah. Richie Davidson at University of Wisconsin he was one of the pioneers in the field, and has had his lab going way before any of the rest of us. So he's certainly somebody that I would consider a thought leader in the field.
Awesome. And as far as books, that's been transformative in your own life, just you personally with your own path in mindfulness and this contemplative path, is there any books that you would personally recommend to friends or family when they ask you, if they're thinking about getting in this area?
Yeah. So there's one book called Mindfulness in Plain English that was written by a guy, Bhante Gunaratna, that I read 3 times. And it's actually, people can find a PDF of it online. It's free, like one of the earlier versions of it. So that's a great book for somebody just getting into the practice. And for those that are getting deeper into the practice, I've been studying with a teacher, Joseph Goldstein, for a number of years now, and he wrote what I would consider like a seminal tome called Mindfulness: A Practical Guide to Awakening. It's his most recent book, and it is big.
Wow. Okay.
So not for the beginner.
Yeah. Amazing. I might have to read that one myself. So if folks want to learn more about you, your work, and follow you online, where can they find all that stuff on the internet?
I would say, so I have a website, judsonbrewer.com, that links to our Claritas Mind website. It links to our, to my lab website at UMass Medical School. And I think it links somewhere else that I can't think of right now. So that's probably the easiest place. Don't look for me on Twitter because I don't do Twitter very much because I think Twitter is addictive.
Yeah.
And if you look at some prominent political figures, you can see where people get caught up in this stuff. It's crazy.
Yeah. All right, that was Judson Brewer. I want to give him a special thanks for sitting down with me today. And if you enjoyed this interview, go check out our blog post that summarizes the interview and gives all the resources and links and all the people that we mentioned in this interview. It's all listed in that blog post for you guys. And go check out his stuff online. He's doing really important work. And as you saw from the interview, it's just really fascinating stuff that he's getting into with the science of mindfulness and hooking meditators into fMRI scanners and just seeing what's going on behind the hood of mindfulness. So if you enjoyed this interview, be sure to subscribe to the podcast Warrior Radio. You get updates on all the new episodes in the future, and it helps grow this project. And be sure to rate us. And with all that said, I'll see you guys on the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.